Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode will cover different opinions on security versus freedom. Over the last decade, there have been an increase in terrorist attacks in many Western countries. As a response to this and more, many governments have taken the decision to be more stringent when it comes to surveillance and security, arguing it is essential in order to protect people. These actions, however, have received pushback both from civil rights groups and other activists who argue that security should not come at the cost of our freedom. This highlights a very interesting debate. Are security and safety more important than liberty and freedom? Today, we will unpick and compare these opinions. Firstly, there's a question of what actually matters. While those supporting security, surprisingly, say that security matters more. What is the point in having freedom if you are unsafe and live in a world full of dangers? Some may advocate that it is worth giving up some freedom in order to be safe. Put simply, having freedom is worthless if you are not safe to use that freedom. Continuing on from this, some argue that the primary goal of any government should be to protect its citizens. The modern phase of governments protecting rights is more of a byproduct of Western liberal ideology. It is not consistent with every form of government. However, when looking to history, we find that almost every government has had a primary goal of protecting its people. And when it comes to who is the biggest threat, many would argue that the biggest threat we face today is terrorism. Some argue that given terrorism is such an important threat to modern societies, it is worth sacrificing, say, the ability to surf the internet freely in order to counter it. If we are able to find people who Google how to make a bomb, that is better for protecting safety than being able to watch YouTube videos without anyone knowing what you watch. Some also argue that the state is not opposed to its citizens. On the contrary, however, its only goal is to provide the best life possible for its people. The state increasing its powers, therefore, in order to provide protection, some would argue, is not a bad thing in itself. Some may also argue that in the digital age, there is no such thing as freedom anymore. It is a lie that we lost long ago. As a result of this, it is more important today to focus on ensuring safety rather than clinging to something which is long gone. And finally, perhaps one of the most critical arguments here is that it only affects those who have done something wrong. Why does it matter if the government knows what TV shows you are watching and what video games you play? More surveillance only really affects those who have something to hide. And given that most people are law-abiding citizens, increased security may not be such a bad thing. For those who support freedom, surprisingly enough, they argue that freedom is more important than security. What is the point in being alive if you are not free to enjoy that life? Sacrificing our freedom for any reason is simply not worth it because it removes the joy of life. If we shut down all our borders, yes, we would greatly reduce terrorism. But then, if I can never leave my country, I am in effect a prisoner. And this whole idea of freedom is consistent with what some view as the main goal of government, to protect the rights and freedom of its citizens. Therefore, to some, it is hypocritical to remove people's rights and liberties in order to improve their safety. And then on this point of terrorism, often acts passed to counter terrorism are done during periods of high emotion in the direct aftermath of a terrorist attack. In reality, the level of surveillance needed is often not as high as is suggested, and not worth sacrificing people's liberties over. Furthermore, it is no surprise that many people fear Big Brother. The idea of an all-pervasive state watching over you is not a place where many people would want to live. Many governments often claim security and order as why they should remain in power, yet it is often a facade for something much worse. Then, just because we have already been and continually are heavily surveyed both by states and social media companies, doesn't mean we should just throw away what liberty we have left. Liberty is something many people take for granted and will surely miss once it is gone. Then, just because the government may only use its power to try to find those who have done or will do wrong, doesn't mean this will always be the case. If we normalise a loss of freedom in order to increase security, we set new standards for how our society works, which in the future could be used maliciously. Moving on to the comparison. Firstly, on this question of what is the key focus in this debate. Well, those supporting security surprisingly argue that security is the most important thing. Being alive is more important than having freedoms, as you need to be safe in order to enjoy them. Those supporting freedom, however, surprisingly again argue that freedom is more important. Why be alive if you are not free to enjoy life? To some, being a prisoner is worse than the risk of being killed by terrorists, and society is not so bad that we need more security. Similar to this, on the question of what is the government's role. Well, those supporting security argue the government's primary role should be to defend its citizens. Every government has always had this job, and only Western liberal democracies believe so strongly in rights. Those disagreeing, however, argue that the goal of the government is to protect the rights and freedoms of its people. Taking away rights for security is therefore hypocritical. Then on the question of how big a risk is terrorism, those supporting security argue that terrorism is an increasingly threatening and growing risk that requires increased action in order to counter, and therefore we may need to curb freedom in order to achieve this. However, those disagreeing argue that terrorism is overstated and not worth losing freedom over. Terrorism evokes emotional, not rational responses, and we need to be more aware of how we react. Then on the question of can the state be trusted? Well, those supporting security argue that the state is only working for the good of its people. It will only use its power to protect citizens. Those disagreeing, however, argue the state cannot be trusted with ever-increasing amounts of power. Bad governments already use security as a facade, and this may only get worse over time. Then on the question of, is freedom even real anymore? Well, those advocating for security over freedom argue that freedom is already gone due to more surveillance and increasing use of the internet, and instead our focus now should be on security and safety. However, those disagreeing argue that just because freedom has been reduced does not mean that we should throw away even more. People will miss the freedom they lose, and we cannot simply disregard it. And then finally, on the question of who is affected by this debate. Well, those supporting security argue that the only people who are truly affected are those who are acting in a bad way for society. Innocent people have nothing to fear from this and should not be scared of increased surveillance and security. However, those on the other side argue that what this does is it opens a Pandora's box for the future, and there is a fear that over time, innocent people too may begin to suffer. Overall then, those who value security over freedom believe that our primary goal, and that of the state, should be safety. Why have rights if you're dead? And they trust the state and claim only those with something to hide have something to fear. On the other hand, those who prioritise freedom argue that liberty and freedom are worth more than anything. Why live life if you're living as a prisoner? They don't agree with benign goals of the state and fear for the future in a world in which liberty and freedom no longer matter. Ultimately though, what do you think? Do you value freedom or security more, and why? Also, is there anything that I missed, got wrong, or could do better? Let me know in the comments or on Twitter. As always, the aim of this episode has been not to try and argue for or against one side of the debate, but rather to highlight the different opinions on the topic and provide a comparison between them. Be sure to check back on Monday for another episode. Thank you all for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.